The final Tales from the Pizzaplex book has finally released. Tales from the Pizzaplex Book 8 is the final book in the series, and the first story is B-7 2, a sequel to the story B-7 from Tales Book 2. This was a very strange thing to see because I feel like B-7 was one of the few stories that didn't need a sequel at all, because I really don't know how they could do a sequel. And judging from the reactions I saw from a lot of people when the leaks happened, maybe it shouldn't have. I feel like other stories, maybe they don't need a sequel, but they at least could have one. But this one, I'm just not quite sure that it makes sense to do this, and I don't really know if it would work. With that being said, I wrote this part of the script before I started reading the story, so obviously I give my opinions on the story at the end, and this is going to be my first summary of Tales 8, but I'll also be doing summaries on the second story, Alone Together, and the third story, Didophobia, as well as the final Tales epilogue. Those videos will be releasing over the next few days, but for now, let's get talking about B-7 2. B-7 2 picks up right where we left off with B-7, and the main character is once again Billy. Billy could hear faded and seemingly far away voices, but they seemed to be getting closer. He hadn't been able to feel anything before, and that was peaceful, but now that was gone, and as he opened his eyes, he found bright lights in the room. He smelled all the things around him, none of which were particularly pleasant, and when he raised his arm, it just amplified his pain. There was a taste in his mouth that he tried to wash away with his tongue until he remembered that he barely had a tongue at all anymore. He found that he was in the hospital, but he didn't know why. The memories of the previous story flooded back. He remembered the car compactor that had begun crushing him. He remembered his deep, dark regrets, and remembered that the compactor was his way to escape it all. So how and why was he here? Suddenly, a woman who seemed to be a nurse came into the room and checked how he was doing. She touched his hands, and Billy was shocked to find that he could feel them, since he remembered having prosthetic limbs. The nurse, whose name was Gloria, gave him water, and when he finished drinking it through a straw, he tried to say "Thank you, Gloria," but the words didn't come out right because most of his tongue was gone. Gloria assured him that while he will have trouble with some letters, he'll be set up with a speech therapist to help him out. She informed him that Dr. Herrera would be here soon, and she patted his leg, which Billy was once again shocked to find that he could feel at all. Dr. Herrera showed up about a half hour later, and Billy was apparently stunned by her immense beauty. She checks how Billy is doing, and she seems nice, but Billy couldn't help but be reminded of Doc, the dude who turned him into the monster he'd only recently discovered himself to be. He knew he only had himself to blame for that, but he wasn't too comfortable with his fate being caught in the hands of another doctor. Dr. Herrera took a seat and told him that they should get caught up on what happened. Billy told her what he remembered, but it was difficult to say the words without his tongue. Somehow, Dr. Herrera understood for the most part. She told him that after the police found him, they thought he could have been attacked and brought to the car, but they decided to go to his house and they found out the truth. Billy was alive now only because of luck. A lot of his organs were damaged and bones were fractured. All the foreign materials he'd gotten added to him had been removed through a series of surgeries, and he'd been placed in a medically induced coma to give his body time to heal. The doctor, who had turned him into the monster he was, had also integrated metal parts and wires into his body, and one of his prosthetic limbs wasn't actually even prosthetic, it was just adjusted enough to make Billy think that it was. The mental hospital that Doc used for his experiments and surgeries was raided, and body parts were found preserved in a freezer. Not all were Billy's, but his right arm was found and had been reattached. The wires throughout his body, the metal plate, and everything else that was added to his body was removed. Dr. Herrera showed him a mirror, and Billy found that he looked mostly normal outside of his missing ears. His hair was growing back, and it was sticking up like it did when he was a little kid. Billy even found some resemblance to his dad in his face. Dr. Herrera told him that because he'd been out for so long, he'd need physical therapy and that he'll need to use crutches until they can get him new prosthetic limbs. Billy was just about done with prosthetic limbs, and Dr. Herrera assured him that they won't do anything to him that he doesn't want done, with a couple small exceptions. Because of what was in his house, it was required that Billy do a psychological evaluation to ensure that he was in his right mind, and if he was deemed competent, all decisions about his healing process would be made by him. Billy let the compactor crush him because it felt right, but his survival felt like a second chance. When he turned himself into a monster, he would only even eat white foods, and while some of the food he got in the hospital like the chicken and rice was familiar, the green beans and jello were really refreshing. The next day, he met his physical therapist, Angie. She helped him stand up and stuff, which was a bit difficult considering he only had one leg, but lucky for him, his pain had dwindled significantly, and by now he was just a little sore. He also didn't need the IV anymore, and Gloria had gotten rid of it. Billy had been healing unusually fast, and he was even able to stand and even walk around pretty well considering the situation, but he ended up a little sore. Angie assured him that when he got new prosthetics it would be easier to move around, but Billy told her that he didn't want new prosthetics. Angie understood why, as she knew what he'd been through, but she told him that before he was using them to be something he isn't, but now he would be using them to get back to being himself. Billy took that in and decided maybe when he was better he would rethink it. The next day, his physical therapy helped him with a bunch of stuff like lowering the rails on his bed, more walking, getting to the bathroom and all that, but after Angie left him, a man named Dr. Coleman came in for the psych evaluation. Dr. Coleman clearly didn't like Billy, constantly staring at where his ears used to be, and Billy didn't like him either. He was glad when he left. He then told Gloria that Dr. Coleman was clearly disgusted by Billy's lack of ears, and Gloria wasn't fond of Dr. Coleman either. Billy told her that he needed a hat and that his ears were ugly, and while Gloria did try to tell him that it was just different rather than ugly, she told him she'd see what she can do about the hat. Later, when she came to collect the tray from his food, she gave him a multicolored crocheted hat one of her co-workers had made, and Billy loved it. Even more surprisingly though, Billy began getting visitors. Ever since his mom died 3 years ago, Billy was pretty isolated, so it was very surprising and also refreshing to have people come visit him. He liked it, and he decided he should have more people in his life going forward. He even told his first visitor, his old child psychologist Dr. Lindstrom, as much. She told him that since she was a child psychologist and Billy was an adult now, that she couldn't help him as a doctor anymore, but that she would be there for him as a friend, telling him to call her Alice. She then realized it would be difficult to pronounce, so she told him to call her Ae, which I find kind of funny. He talked to her for about an hour, and later 2 friends from childhood came into the room, Clark and Peter. He remembered Clark to have acted like a robot with him in kindergarten, but unlike Billy, he never actually thought that he was a robot. Apparently, Billy was a big deal at the moment, as he was the robot kid who survived being crushed, but Billy assured Peter and Clark that he wasn't a robot. At the same time, though, he wasn't B-7, but he also wasn't the kid that he was before being B-7. He was in a weird middle ground, and he didn't know how to feel about it. Clark and Peter teased Billy's animatronic face for a few minutes, and while Billy felt like maybe he should have been offended, he wasn't. He felt like the two were treating him like a bro. When they left, they first made sure to let Billy know they'd visit again, and gave him their phone numbers and address, an apartment near their college that they lived together in. After that, he got a few more visitors. First, Fran and Ned, who used to deliver Billy his groceries, and then Billy's grandma. He remembered his grandma as a grumpy figure whom he hadn't seen since he was 6. She told him that she was glad he finally came to his senses and began talking about her retirement and how she spent her time. Billy didn't know what to say to her. She felt like a stranger to him. After about 20 minutes, she looked at her watch, told him that they'd get to know each other, and told him to focus on getting well before she left. Today was a good day, and he was happy to have had visitors, but he wasn't really sure who he was anymore. He felt like there were a lot of missing pieces of him, and he wasn't sure how to find them again. Over time, Billy learned sleeping in the hospital wasn't easy. Nurses would often come into his room in the middle of the night to check his pulse or give him medication. Tonight, though, that didn't seem to happen. After being asleep for over 5 hours, Billy woke up at 2:24 a.m. He heard his name being called, each letter being drawn out. His name was called numerous times, and he got out of bed and began to follow the voice. He went into the hallway and found out that it was completely empty, which it never usually was. It was strange. He also began to hear an occasional scrape and thunk, as well as a whooshing sound and a rhythmic beeping, which all seemed to be far away. He heard his name again and thought maybe it came from a floor below him. He began heading towards the elevator while at the same time wondering why he was heading in the direction of something that was unsettling him. He felt like the voice was summoning him and he had to go. He managed to get to the elevator after a few minutes, and right before he was about to hit the button, it opened by itself and Billy heard his name again. He was confused, of course, but he thought there must be a valid explanation. He went into the elevator and went down to the lobby, but the door strangely didn't open. It kept going down and the number display read B1, then B2, then B3. The door opened and the janitor got in as Billy decided to get out. He heard his name again, and while the voice was slightly still muted, it was clearer now than it had been before. This hallway was creepy, and Billy could feel that the voice was coming from the closed brown metal door at the end of this hallway. He made it into the room and turned to a cabinet on the back wall of the room. His inner voice told him not to open it, and Billy knew why. He knew that on the other side of this cabinet, which really looked more like a morgue drawer, was the other half of Billy. Even though it was closed, Billy felt like he could see through it. He could see the version of Billy with all the metal and plastic parts that had been added to it, the parts that Dr. Herrera had removed. This version of Billy begged to be released, but Billy wanted to be a person, not B-7 the robot. He had begun to open it when a hospital security guard named Paul stopped it, ushering him back to his room as he wasn't supposed to be in here. As Billy was escorted out of the room, he saw that he'd managed to open the cabinet door slightly, and it remained open. Billy woke up later back in his room. He thought about his trip downstairs and he had been sore. Clearly he had exerted himself too much. Suddenly he began to hear a bunch of clicking and squelching sounds very nearby. He looked at his doorway and saw a trail that was made up of a dark red substance and a viscous black substance. Billy knew what the slithering in his direction was. He could smell rotting flesh and motor oil. Billy began to scream and scrambled off his bed. He headed towards his door and the clicking and squelching sounded behind him, speeding up and getting louder. Billy moved as fast as he could out of his room. He saw a nurse at the nurse's station, but he didn't stop for help. He made it about 20 feet away before making it to a security guard who stopped him. He began being taken back to his room and tried to say that there was something in his room, but his words couldn't have been understood. When he eventually made it back to his room, he had been restrained and given something that made him woozy. He couldn't escape the animatronic in his room, which sounded again. The voice he'd heard before said the words, "I want back in." The voice sounded like it was coming through a damaged synthesizer, just like the one Billy had as B-7. The voice continued talking to him. It told him that it just wanted to help him. It told him they were buddies and that they were better together. The voice referred to Billy as B-7. Billy adjusted and he could see the metal and plastic head with bits of bloody flesh and tissue clung to a tangled mass of metal plates and other mechanical parts. All the parts he'd added to himself to become B-7. The voice told him that everyone wanted to control him, but that it wanted to help him. It wanted Billy to be happy and live his true life as an animatronic. They were designed to be one. Billy wanted to block out the words, but he couldn't. He wanted to cover his ears, but the restraints wouldn't allow him to. Eventually, Billy managed to fall asleep. The next day, he couldn't really remember what happened, but he was pretty sure something more than just a panic attack happened, even if he couldn't remember exactly what had happened. The next week, Billy's grandma took him home to the yellow cottage she lived in on an acre of land with woods around it. The house had a bunch of ramps around, which made it easy for Billy to move around. Billy had basically withdrawn into himself, but he didn't know if it was because he had been placed in his grandma's care, or if it had been something to do with a night he couldn't remember. Even though Billy's new life began hopeful, Billy realized that the world was too big for him, and he had no idea how to live as a man because he hadn't grown up like a normal child does. Billy's grandma showed him around the house, and one thing he noted is that the ticking of the clock annoyed him, but he didn't know why. A lot of the sounds in the house were kinda intrusive to Billy. A bunch of pretty unimportant descriptions of the house are provided. I don't really need to bore you with it all. Billy did find that he didn't like the floral patterns on the walls, but he didn't know how he would redecorate it if he could. At least he had a place to stay while he discovered his tastes. Billy's grandma had also retrieved some of his belongings and bought him new stuff, and she had to carry it all inside the house herself as Billy wasn't really capable. Billy wasn't sure exactly how normal people lived, but he knew people didn't usually let their 82-year-old grandmothers carry stuff inside for them, so he felt bad. Billy found that he very much liked lasagna and chocolate, but he also found that his grandma didn't have a TV, cell phone, and had gotten rid of his computer so he couldn't play video games. He had played games and surfed the internet when he was B7, but now he thought he'd be happier in the hospital. At least they had TV. Billy decided he wanted to go back to the hospital tomorrow as he didn't really much like his grandma's house. While he was getting ready for bed, Billy saw a smear of red sauce from the lasagna, which, like red paint on his grandma's face earlier, reminded him of blood. Suddenly, because of a few sounds he'd heard in the bathroom, Billy remembered what had happened on the night he couldn't remember. He didn't want to remember, but he did, and he knew he couldn't go back to the hospital or else B7 would find him. He decided that while he didn't like it at his grandma's house, it was the best place for him to be, safe and away from B7. Over time, Billy got used to his grandma and her house, and she seemed to be getting used to his missing pieces and the way he spoke. His grandma had also told him the story about the ticking grandfather clock and how her great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had been a doctor and someone made the clock for him as payment for his services. The clock had been passed down for generations, and she wanted to go to Billy's dad when she was gone. Billy didn't really know much about his dad since he'd left him. Billy became fond of the clock, and it was more soothing than annoying now. Billy got good at doing chores around the house despite only having one leg to balance on and one hand to work with. Billy got used to living with his grandma, and the book tells us about how he spends his days and stuff, which isn't really important. It mostly consists of drinking coffee or hot chocolate, fixing things, eating, and playing games, and hearing grandma's rotary phone ringing from a distance at the end of the day. Billy always wondered who it was calling, but it wasn't his business. He also went to church with his grandma. He was self-conscious about that as he thought people would stare at him, but everyone just treated him like a normal person, and Billy thought the time at church was actually nice. Afterwards, some people came up to him to greet him, and a man named Frank and he decided to go fishing together next week. No one seemed to take issue at all with the way he spoke or looked. No one judged him. He was happy when he got back after church. That day, he went to sleep early, as while he enjoyed seeing people, it took a lot of energy out of him. Before going to sleep, he heard the sound of the phone, which for some reason unsettled him, but he didn't know why. As the week passed, it started bothering him more and more, but he could never put a finger on why. The following Sunday, he went fishing with Frank, and while he found it to be a bit boring, he thought it was peaceful, and he liked Frank as he was easy to talk to. Frank was a private eye story writer, and after talking to him, Billy decided maybe he could be a writer. His options were limited seeing as he was missing 2 limbs, but maybe being a writer was a good option. Frank ended up giving him a notebook and gave him the advice that he should write whatever comes to mind, and so he did. Every day, he wrote. He also started getting closer with his grandma and discovered that she had a fun side to her. While Billy didn't like flowers, he helped out his grandma in the flower garden. They shared a few jokes as they worked, and after that, he liked flowers. Billy continued hearing his grandma getting phone calls and noticed that it was strangely at exactly 9:03 every night. He figured she didn't want him to hear since she spoke in a hushed tone, but that made him even more uneasy. He wrote about his questions in his journal but didn't reach any conclusions. Even when he tried to listen into his grandma's calls, he couldn't hear what she said. He told himself it was none of his business. He knew something was going on, but there was nothing to do about it. A couple weeks went by and Billy's pain was pretty much gone and he was getting stronger again. He decided that he needs more life experience and needs to go outside the town he was currently living in, even though he enjoyed it. He finally decided he should get new prosthetics, and Ai gave him all the information that he needed. One night, Billy decided it would be his last night with his grandma, and she went to bed early that night. He'd tell her the next morning that he'd be leaving. He didn't think she'd be upset. However, Billy was determined to figure out what the phone calls were all about, so he stood by his grandma's bedroom door at 9:03. However, the phone didn't ring. After a couple minutes of waiting, Billy realized he could hear his grandma talking. Not whispering, actually talking. Billy called for her, but she didn't answer, she just kept talking. So he opened the door and went into her bedroom, knowing it was rude, but he didn't care. He didn't know what he'd expected to see when he opened the door, but he'd have been wrong no matter what he guessed. When he entered his grandma's room, he saw B-7 in her room inching towards her. She was talking to B-7, encouraging it rather than trying to get away from it. She told it that she was sorry for not allowing it to become one with Billy again, even though she knew that's what it wanted. Apparently, Billy's grandma had been bonding with B-7, and it didn't have to be alone anymore. Suddenly, B-7 inched closer to Billy's grandma and pierced her leg. Billy expected her to scream, but while she had an edge to her voice signifying she was in pain, she didn't scream. Parts of B-7 etched into Billy's grandma's leg and literally cut it off and replaced it. B-7 began attaching to other parts of her body. She encouraged it. Billy wanted to help her, but she told him to let it happen. Billy had difficulty accepting what he was hearing. The monster Billy's 5-year-old self created was now possessing and mutilating his grandma's body, and all Billy could do was stand there. B-7 turned to him and told him that he wanted to be with Billy, but that he couldn't, so he sought out Billy's grandma to be close to him through her. Billy didn't care what B-7 had to say. Instead, he cared that his grandma continued to fuse with B-7, continuing to be mutilated with her organs being taken over and her limbs being severed. B-7 began shaking as if it was scared, and Billy's grandma forced it to continue merging with her. She turned to Billy and told him that she'd been terminal for quite some time. B-7 begged Billy for help, but to no avail. What seems to be happening is that Billy's grandma was actually in her right mind, but B-7 had been calling to her trying to get to Billy. She knew it wouldn't give up, so she got B-7 to merge with her. As it did so, it found that she was going to die, and if it was merged with her, it would die too. She basically died and decided to take B-7 with her so that Billy could live his life. She tells Billy not to mourn her death and to enjoy his life, and then she dies along with what was left of B-7. We cut ahead to after all that was done with. Billy had gotten Frank to help him bury his grandma and B-7, though I'm not sure how he managed to explain it. Frank would look after his grandma's house for as long as was needed, and he dropped Billy off at the hospital and told him to have adventures and experience life to write something interesting. Billy got a new prosthetic arm and leg and quickly got used to them. He'd been living with Clark and Peter and getting to know a few other guys while the process of getting those prosthetics was going on. He bought a plane ticket to Peru where his dad lived, hoping to one day find his dad. Billy was scared, but also hopeful. He thought the trip could be good or bad, but either way, it would end up being a life experience that would be worth writing about, and the story ends right there. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I honestly think that this story was god-awful. There's no doubt in my mind that this is the worst Tales from the Pizzaplex story. I just feel like it was so pointless and stupid, and the storyline was just kind of dumb. It kind of ruins the original B-7, which I think was a great story, and basically completely destroys the ending of it. But hey, maybe you guys disagree, so let me know in the comments what you think of the story. Do you like it, or do you think it's bad like I do? Let me know in the comments, and if you did enjoy this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to, and stay tuned for my summary on the second story in this book, Alone Together. But that's all, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye, guys!